December 26th, 1991.
From Moscow to Berlin to Washington, he changed the world forever. Mikhail Gorbachev. Tonight, an unprecedented behind-the-scenes look at Gorbachev's final days in office.
For the past several days, we have been inside the Kremlin, watching as the power of one of the most celebrated leaders of our time drained away.
Ted Koppel reports exclusively on the backstage maneuvering, the handing over of nuclear launch codes, and Gorbachev's philosophy on the brink of resignation.
People are born, people suffer, and people die.
Watch history unfold as Gorbachev takes his final stroll through the Kremlin grounds.
As you walk around the Kremlin again for what is really going to be your last day, what thoughts go through your mind?
Алло.
And witness another extraordinary moment.
Да, Джордж, дорогой, приветствую.
Primetime was there to hear what Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush said to each other in the final hours before the Soviet president stepped down. Gorbachev, the revolutionary who fell victim to his own reform.
May I ask you a couple of questions? In your new capacity as the Prime
In an intimate conversation with Ted Koppel immediately after his resignation, Gorbachev talks about handing over the reins of power and how he's been treated by the Boris Yeltsin camp.
Some people, they sometimes do certain things indecently and immorally.
Tonight, what's next for Gorbachev and the new world he helped create?
From ABC News, with anchors Diane Sawyer, Sam Donaldson, Chief Correspondent Chris Wallace, Judd Rose, Jay Shadler, Sylvia Chase, John Quinones, and reporting from the Kremlin, Ted Koppel. A special edition of Primetime. Gorbachev, the final hours. Primetime. Now from Washington, Sam Donaldson.
Good evening. Diane is off tonight. This week produced one of those events that can change the course of civilization. The last president of the Soviet Union resigned his office, and the Soviet Union, the evil empire of its time, ceased to exist. How often have we wished we could witness such events firsthand from the inside? Well, Ted Koppel has done just that. He watched it happen in Moscow over the past week at the side of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last of the Soviet leaders, the man who many believe brought it about. Koppel was there as Gorbachev and the Soviet Union passed into history.
Listen to the sounds of a coup. A revolution. The collapse of what was, until recently, one of the most awesomely fearsome countries in the world. Listen as the power of one regime ebbs out of the Kremlin, making way for the next regime. For many members of Mikhail Gorbachev's staff, last Friday marked their final payday. The winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Time magazine's Man of the Decade, the architect of perestroika and glasnost, was informed, prematurely as it turns out, that he had already signed his own resignation. He read about it in a Moscow newspaper.
Указ об отставке Горбачева подписан. Горбачев подписал указ о своей отставке.
For the past several days, we have been inside the Kremlin, watching as the power of one of the most celebrated leaders of our time drained away. The most visible symbol of that power, an innocuous-looking briefcase holding the launch codes of the Soviet Union's strategic nuclear arsenal. Last Saturday, that briefcase still sat on Mikhail Gorbachev's desk. Gorbachev himself was in a friendly, if philosophical, frame of mind.
Поставил вопрос, чем отличается политик от государственного деятеля?
What is the difference between the statesman and the politician?
И сказал, что политик думает об очередных выборах.
And he said that the politician thinks about the next
А
election,
государственный деятель
but the
думает
statesman
о будущем.
thinks about the future.
At the very moment that we sat in Gorbachev's Kremlin office, 3 time zones and more than 2,000 miles away in Alma-Ata, the capital of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union was being formally dissolved. And Boris Yeltsin was publicly spelling out the terms of Gorbachev's retirement.
Мы с уважением относимся к Михаилу Сергеевичу Горбачеву.
We respect Mikhail Gorbachev and do not want to continue the tradition that has evolved since 1917, that is to bury every leader of the nation or to treat him as a criminal. Therefore, we have made provisions for his retirement after his resignation.
It is not, Gorbachev was telling me, his own political future that concerns him now.
There is so much tension today in our society, so many problems. Our society simply may not be able to bear it.
By last Sunday morning, Gorbachev's warning of the previous evening had already been realized. Civil war broke out in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. At the same time, in Moscow, several thousand demonstrators, nostalgic for the iron-fisted control of hard-line communism, voiced their impartial contempt for both Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The tin spoon beating on an empty pot may yet prove to be the most powerful symbol in this new and uneasy Commonwealth. And this plane load of U.S. military rations left over from Operation Desert Storm and shipped into Moscow, another event that took place last Sunday, is too puny a counter-symbol to make much difference. This is the view from Gorbachev's office. The night that bridged last Saturday and Sunday was literally the longest and darkest of the year. Communism is sputtering out in Moscow just as the long Russian winter begins. The red flag of Soviet communism still flew last weekend, but it flew over a country that no longer exists. I asked Gorbachev if there was a fable, perhaps, or a parable that he might tell to an American grandchild to explain what's happening in his country.
Притчу, которую я очень воспринял давно.
There is a fable
И очень
that I learned years ago
серьезно.
and that I treat very seriously.
В какие-то века появился на Востоке молодой правитель и
Centuries
хотел
ago,
править не
there
так,
was
как до него
a young
правили,
ruler in the Orient, and he wanted to rule in a different way, in a more human way, in his kingdom.
Он запросил мнение мудрецов.
And he asked the views of the wise men.
Через 10 лет ему привезли 20 повозок советов.
And it took 10 years to bring 20 carts with volumes of advice.
Он сказал, когда я буду читать, мне надо работу вести,
said,
управлять.
When am I going to read all that? I have to govern my state,
Через
my
10
country.
лет ему привезли десяток томов.
10 years later, they brought him just 10 volumes of advice.
Он сказал, что это много.
He said that too is too much.
Тогда через 5 лет ему привезли
5
книжечку.
years later, he was brought just one volume,
Но,
small
к
volume.
сожалению, уже вот 25 лет прошло,
But
и он
unfortunately,
лежал на смертном одре.
25 years had passed and he was on his deathbed.
И когда этот мудрец
And when
посмотрел на него, он даже не стал ему книгу
the
давать.
wise man looked at the book, he didn't even
Ситуация
give
ясна.
the book
Но
to
тем не
that
менее
dying
он сказал, а
man.
в общем, все то, что здесь написано,
He said, well, all in all that is
можно
here
свести в
can
простой
be
форме.
summarized in a simple formula.
Люди рождаются,
People are born,
страдают
people suffer,
и умирают.
and people die.
По-моему, очень емкая форма.
Still ahead, a final walk through the Kremlin. a courtesy call to an old friend,
Да, Джордж, дорогой, приветствую.
and the last meeting President Gorbachev will have with his longtime personal staff.
Всю мою позицию, которую я не совершенно напрасно, но я должен даже народ.
More on Gorbachev's final hours when Primetime continues. Primetime continues. From Moscow, Ted Koppel.
We have been inside that historic building, inside the Kremlin, for most of the past week, sitting just down the corridor from Mikhail Gorbachev's office, waiting for word of his resignation. When we picked up our vigil this past Monday morning, we were told that Gorbachev would be taping his farewell speech to the nation in a matter of minutes. He was, we were told, getting a haircut. Waiting with us was Gorbachev's makeup artist. At one point, a member of the president's personal security guard came to the door to tell us that Gorbachev was a minute away. The president's desk, with the Soviet flag behind it, was fully lit. 2 live cameras from Soviet state television were already beaming the signal out for taping. Gorbachev never showed up. It was just past 11 a.m. and Boris Yeltsin had come to the Kremlin for a meeting. Gorbachev gave his personal approval for our cameras to be present. Yeltsin said no. The cameras stayed out. It was a meeting that would drag on for almost 8 hours. As we waited, we spoke to members of Gorbachev's staff, to his national security advisor, Anatoly Chernyayev. Physically, literally, what is happening right now?
Since mid-last week, these telephones have been silent, so far as work is concerned. The big telephones, government communication telephones.
We talked with Gorbachev's spokesman, Andrei Grachov.
Here, the press service, as you've noticed, is getting the avalanche of phone calls.
All the same question?
Yes.
When?
Yes.
The meeting between Gorbachev and Yeltsin focused for several hours, we were later told, on the issue of nuclear launch codes, the Soviet command and control system.
While Gorbachev was the president, while the key to that nuclear formula, the codes and the formula, was in his brain, we could be calm. We could rest quietly. But now that this key is being removed from his hand, I am worried about the control of the operational nuclear weapons.
The 2 men covered a lot of ground. And although Gorbachev is not normally a heavy drinker, according to at least one account, both men hoisted a few. Yeltsin agreed to provide a couple of former Communist Party office buildings for an institute on foreign affairs that Gorbachev wants to run. Gorbachev will reportedly receive a pension equal to his salary as state president, and 20 men will be provided for a continuing, if diminished, security detail. The presidential security detail is run at the moment by Valery Pestov. Until last August's coup, he reported directly to the head of the KGB. Since August, he has answered only to Gorbachev.
I'm Russian. My homeland is here, and I shall be working for the good of my homeland, Russia, first and foremost. And I will work with equal zeal, loyalty, and commitment wherever I have to do it, whether with Mr. Gorbachev or wherever my duty calls me to go.
Many among Gorbachev's staff will not stay on, even if asked. They find something unseemly about the way their president is being pushed out of office. Some have even described it as a sort of democratic coup. Gorbachev's English language interpreter, Pavel Palashenko, always at his side during U.S.-Soviet summit meetings these past 6 years, Palashenko stops just short of calling it a coup.
As for whether the word coup should be used, maybe, I might want to use it, but Gorbachev specifically rejected this description. And so I think I'll go with him. It is a change that is being operated by democratically elected people in a less than democratic and fair way.
By Tuesday morning, the last broad strokes of Gorbachev's presidency had been sketched in. He summoned his senior staff members to a final meeting. His farewell address to the nation, to the fragments of what used to be the nation, he told them, would be broadcast live at 7 p.m. Wednesday, Moscow time. At the staff meeting, Gorbachev looks tired. The strain is beginning to show. But he directs his staff, his advisors, some of them his close friends, to keep their personal feelings under control.
Всю мою позицию, которую я не совершенно напрасно, но я должен даже наступить и себе на голову и вам советую сейчас позицию. Народ в тяжелом состоянии.
As Tuesday, Gorbachev's last full day in office, wears on, there are personal visits from foreign ambassadors, calls from overseas, some final editing on the speech. The last hours of the working day are spent in private conversation with old friends. Alexander Yakovlev, one of the principal contributors to the policy of restructuring the state, perestroika. Igor Yakovlev, who runs Gostel Radio, the state radio and television network. And finally, at day's end, a weary-looking Eduard Shevardnadze, Gorbachev's once and current foreign minister, comes to the Kremlin to consult one more time with his old colleague. Things are going reasonably well, he allows, but then he adds, reasonably. That may be the best word for it. It is, Shevardnadze says with a sad smile, as much as could be expected.
When we return, final preparations for resignation as Mikhail Gorbachev spends his last hours as president of the now dissolved Soviet Union.
I've said many times I've been feeling over the recent days absolutely calm and free.
When Primetime continues, after this from our ABC stations. Primetime continues from Moscow.
Wednesday morning, Christmas Day at the Kremlin, President Gorbachev's last day on the job. He has agreed to meet us for a morning stroll somewhere on the Kremlin grounds. Our two Russian camera crews, on friendly terms with his security detail, know where to go and when. We, on the other hand, have gone through channels and are waiting on the other side of Ivanov Square for someone from the Kremlin bureaucracy to take us to the president. He is already briskly on his way towards us, passing surprised and sometimes bemused groups of Kremlin sightseers. I catch up with Mr. Gorbachev in mid-stride. As you walk around the Kremlin again for what is really going to be your last day, what thoughts go through your mind?
The Kremlin has stood and will stand forever. Some things are stronger and more enduring than the political battles that spring up in this or some other historical time. Of course, I want very much for everything to be continued. This is the most important thing.
As we stopped in front of Gorbachev's Kremlin office, I asked him to recall some of the highlights of the past 6 years.
You know, I remember on the political side, the major agreements, the treaties that we signed, they were sort of finished, one part in Washington, the other part in Moscow. On the human side, those walks here in Red Square, when we talked with people.
What we've decided to do is talk to each other instead of about each other.
It was exciting. Those beautiful days with sunshine, we had cordial and warm talks. And I would say this was symbolic. The fact that the leaders of two such nations were finally doing business in this manner. Having a chance to communicate and meet people both in Washington and in Moscow. That was beautiful.
Do you remember some of the small moments also, like when you got out of your car? I don't know if you remember the street, but it was on Connecticut Avenue in Washington. And all the Washingtonians were out to lunch, and they greeted you for the first time. Do you remember that moment, and what memories do you have of it?
Yes, I was with Vice President Bush at that moment. It was entirely spontaneous. I said to him, let's stop. People were standing around. They were watching what was going on. We stopped and shook hands with them.
I want to say hello to you.
I just couldn't believe it. It's great that he came out to meet us all like that. That was wonderful. He wants world peace. He wants world peace? Yes. The guy is a PR genius. I mean, jumping out of the car like that. Unbelievable. Great.
Импонировало прежде всего.
Above all, I like people's spontaneity, their openness, frankness in their discussions. This is what I think forms the basis of the society. Freedom is given to the human being, and you have to learn how to use it.
I don't want you to catch cold on your last day. But I do want to ask you one more question. Your thoughts this morning when you left home, when you said goodbye to your wife.
Ну, знаете, ведь это уже, в общем-то, сегодняшний день, это итог, а уже, я не раз говорил, я...
Well, you know, today is a culmination of sorts. I've said many times I've been feeling over the recent days absolutely calm and free. So today I wouldn't say anything has changed, because everything has been decided already. Everything is clear. I think only the roles are being changed. I am not leaving either political or public life. It happens probably for the first time here, and even in this, I have turned out to be a pioneer. That is, the process is after all a democratic one.
Everything is going in the frame of democracy.
And my resignation from President's office does not mean political death. I am not going to confine myself. I am not going to stop my activities. They will continue. So I can't say anything surprising to you. Everything is normal. Everything is normal. Probably because I have made my decision. And you know, the psychological stress is hardest until you make the decision. The most important thing is to make the decision.
You look more relaxed today than you did yesterday. Yesterday you looked a little tired. Today you look as though you're at peace with yourself.
Thank you very much.
President Gorbachev left us to spend his final day in office. In a sense, although the Soviet Union had already been formally dissolved, these were the last hours of the Soviet presidency. Dusk in these early winter days falls by mid-afternoon. At 5 o'clock precisely, Moscow time, President Mikhail Gorbachev placed a call to President George Bush at Camp David in Maryland, where it was 10 o'clock Christmas morning. In what may well be the most extraordinary access ever granted to an American news team inside the Kremlin, we were given exclusive rights to videotape the conversation.
Алло. Да, Джордж, дорогой, приветствую.
George, my dear friend, I greet you.
Поздравить вас с Рождеством и Барбару.
Let me begin by saying something pleasant. I would like to say Merry Christmas to you and to Barbara and to your entire family.
Я даже думал, когда...
I was thinking when I should make my statement, Tuesday or Wednesday. I finally decided that it should be today, by the end of the day today.
Gorbachev's first appeal to President Bush was that he do whatever possible to prevent the disintegration and destruction of the newly independent republics in what was once the Soviet Union. And then, in a scene reminiscent of many a Hollywood movie, the President of the Soviet Union raised one final time with the President of the United States the subject of nuclear weapons and their control in the new country of Russia.
I have here on my table the decree of the President of the USSR. In connection with my resignation, I also resigned the duties of the Commander-in-Chief, and I transfer the authority to use nuclear weapons to the President of the Russian Federation. Everything remains and will remain under very strict control.
Ты можешь спокойно провести рождественский вечер.
You can have a very quiet Christmas evening.
Even the most private, the most confidential of such conversations have a certain stiffness to them, conducted as they are through interpreters. Gorbachev's interpreter was wearing one of our microphones. It picked up occasional snatches of what President Bush had to say. Mr. Bush promised to do what he could to help the Russian Republic. Then, President Bush commented on the transfer of control over nuclear weapons.
I appreciate your comments on the nuclear question. This is of vital international significance, of course, and I commend you for the way you have handled that. I commend you.
President Bush, spending the Christmas holidays at Camp David with the First Lady and 3 of their grandchildren, recalled a Gorbachev visit to the presidential retreat. And then Mikhail Gorbachev said goodbye.
Our role may change, and in fact, they will change. But I would like to assure you that what we have developed over these years will be with us forever. From me and Raisa, very warm greetings, and once again, Merry Christmas to you.
It was, in all respects, a warm conversation, filled with the promise of a close and continuing relationship. But it would be, as both men clearly knew, a radically different relationship, as Mikhail Gorbachev moved on to the next item of Wednesday's agenda, his resignation speech.
Coming up, behind the scenes of the speech Mikhail Gorbachev never wanted to make.
This country was going nowhere, and we couldn't possibly live the way we did. We had to change everything radically.
An historic era comes to an end when Primetime continues. And now, Primetime continues.
Gorbachev to Yeltsin. This week's passing of the baton marks a startling break with the Soviet tradition. Ominous music on the radio. That used to be the only clue for people in the Soviet Union that one of their leaders was on his way out or gone. The legacy of secrecy started with Vladimir Lenin, founding father of the Soviet Union. When he died in 1924, he had actually been very ill for more than a year, nearly incapacitated. But most people didn't know it. At his funeral, the world learned how to crack the mystery of succession. The official who is most prominent is usually the one. The first time, it was Joseph Stalin. 29 years later, in March of 1953, when Stalin suffered a devastating brain hemorrhage, it was hidden from the public for 48 hours. He died 4 days later. When Nikita Khrushchev lost power, it wasn't because he died. He was unceremoniously ousted by the Politburo in 1964. But the Soviet public hardly seemed to notice. There was virtually no reaction when the government announced Khrushchev's so-called resignation. When he died 7 years later, he was referred to only as NS Khrushchev, a special pensioner. Khrushchev was followed by Leonid Brezhnev, who ran the country for 18 years. On November 10th, 1982, somber music was played in Moscow, and the rumors began to fly. But the official announcement didn't come until a day later. Brezhnev had died at age 75. Once again, the man who planned the burial turned out to be the successor, Yuri Andropov, who would last only 2 short years. Andropov had been conspicuously absent from the public stage before he died in February 1984. Official word was he had a cold. Even that small admission was remarkable. In fact, Andropov had been seriously ill for most of his short time in power. His death was not announced until more than 20 hours after it happened. He was replaced by another aging member of the Politburo, Konstantin Chernenko, who lasted barely 13 months. When Chernenko died in March 1985, succession was unusually quick. Within hours, the Kremlin announced Mikhail Gorbachev would take over. Yesterday, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, left office for a unique reason. The country he headed had ceased to exist.
More on his extraordinary resignation and his plans for the future when Primetime continues.
Now, there was only one more official act for Mikhail Gorbachev to perform. His final address to the nation as President of the Soviet Union. The speech in which he would announce his resignation. At 7 o'clock last night, Moscow time, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned his post as President of the Soviet Union. That came as no surprise. But Gorbachev was still capable of summarizing why he did what he has done over the past 6 years with refreshing bluntness.
We had a lot of everything: land, oil, and gas, other natural resources. And there was intellect and talent in abundance. However, we were living much worse than people in the industrialized countries, and we were increasingly lagging behind them. The reason was obvious even then. The country was suffocating in the shackles of the bureaucratic command system, doomed to cater to ideology and suffer and carry the onerous burden of the arms race. It found itself at the breaking point. All the half-hearted reforms, and there have been a lot of them, fell through one after another. This country was going nowhere, and we couldn't possibly live the way we did. We had to change everything radically.
A little more than an hour after his resignation speech, having handed over the nuclear codes to a group of senior army officers headed by the Russian Minister of Defense, Gorbachev again invited us into his office for a brief final conversation.
Ted, I understand we're saying goodbye. But I'm not saying farewell.
I hope not. May I ask you a couple of questions in your new capacity as a private citizen? What are you going to do tomorrow?
Tomorrow I will still be here sorting out some papers and some personal effects. Some will be sent to the archives, some will be destroyed, some I will take to my country home and some to my city apartment. So I have to do it. It's the big wash.
You just met with the Russian defense minister, and I understand you handed over the codes.
Вы только что встречались с министром обороны России, как он сказал, и, как я понимаю, передали коды.
This is the first time in 6 years.
I signed the decree that I mentioned to you. The decree has now been sent and given to Yeltsin. I invited the officers who were on duty with me, worked with me, and I gave all that is necessary to them for transfer.
Теперь кнопка на ядерном оружии уже у Ельцина.
The nuclear button is now already with Yeltsin.
There have been ongoing differences between Yeltsin and Gorbachev, including the issue of whether Yeltsin would be present at the Kremlin last night for the transfer of power. But on that question, at least, Gorbachev played down the friction.
Короче говоря,
Well, to put it briefly,
этот механизм у нас
this
обсуждался,
is the
как я передам.
mechanism, the arrangement that we discussed, the arrangement for transfer.
Вот мы остановились на
And
этом
we
варианте.
decided to do it this way.
И было предложение
There was a proposal
и встретиться,
that there should be a meeting to transfer.
и было вот это
There was a
предложение.
proposal to do it in this way, the way we did it.
В общем, тут ничего
So,
такого
finally,
из
we
ряда
settled on
выходящего
this,
нет.
and there's nothing extraordinary.
But Gorbachev was clearly annoyed by the behavior of Yeltsin's staff, which in some cases has been pressing Gorbachev's aides, and according to one report, his wife Raisa, to move on and out.
Правда, вокруг этого и надо
I have to say that around this
появляются такие
matter,
моменты, которые
there
удивляют
are
удивлением.
certain aspects that are amazing,
Но я не думаю, что это
not
связано с
surprising.
президентом
I don't
Ельциным.
think that this is
Я
being
думаю,
done by
это
President
Есть
Yeltsin.
люди,
I think it
которые
is
в
some
такие
people
моменты очень хотят угодить,
who would like to
поэтому в своем
maybe
угодничестве
curry favor
они
with him,
теряют
and in
порядочность,
doing that
культуру,
they sometimes do certain things
мораль.
indecently
Ну,
and immorally.
это бог с ними.
But, well, I'll set that
А
aside.
так все нормально, в принципе, все нормально.
But in general, all is being done in a fairly
Я
good way.
никогда не унижу себя и
I
не
will never
унижу до
stoop
того,
so
что я
low
буду
as
опускаться до уровня
to
этих
be at the level of
бегающих и
those
шныряющей публики
people
вокруг
running around,
президентов и
some
власть имущих.
presidents and people in power.
And indeed, in all we saw over these last few extraordinary days, Mikhail Gorbachev personified John Kennedy's definition of courage, a man who showed grace under pressure. This phase in the story is over. Last night, in what is presumably the last time, the Soviet flag was lowered from where it has flown for so long over the Kremlin. And the flag of Russia, with all that it symbolizes, was raised in its place. It is no exaggeration to say that this broadcast would not have been possible without the cooperation of Soviet state television, Gostelradio. They gained access for us to events that no American journalist has ever witnessed before. We offer them our deepest thanks. Soviet television now also passes under Russian control, so it is probably quite accurate to say that this program may have been one of the final acts of U.S.-Soviet cooperation. Sam?
Thank you, Ted. While the era of U.S.-Soviet cooperation may be over, a new era of cooperation between the United States and Russia is just beginning. Just today, President Bush indicated he's ready to do business with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Mr. Bush said he'd like to sit down and talk with Yeltsin sometime soon to discuss some important issues, especially nuclear weapons. The president said he and Yeltsin have discussed a meeting, but no date has been set. As for Gorbachev himself, today he reiterated his support for Yeltsin, as long as his one-time ally turned rival continues to pursue democratic reforms. He also said he's received thousands of telegrams of support and sympathy. Earlier today, I talked to ABC's Jim Laurie, a longtime Gorbachev watcher who was for many years ABC News bureau chief in Moscow. Jim, on this first day as a member of the unemployed, Gorbachev was out and about. What was his mood and what did you do?
Well, for a man who had just lost his job and lost his country, he was in a remarkably good mood. He was hosted at a reception for staff members and reporters here in Moscow, and he sipped lemon vodka and toasted the assembled crowd. A bit ironic that, because Mr. Gorbachev some years ago launched a campaign against alcohol. When he was asked about that, he said, "Do you think I can't drink now? Now I can afford to drink," said Gorbachev. In order to make a break with the past, he said he was going to escape for about 2 weeks. He said he would disappear.
Well, Jim, you just said that Gorbachev said that he could afford to drink now, but can he really afford it? And I mean by that he's out of work. I understand he has a pension which amounts to something like $40 American a month. How's he going to live?
Well, he will be provided an apartment in Moscow, plus a country home, a dacha outside of Moscow, not the one that he's in now. In fact, today, they moved the furniture out of the dacha just outside Moscow where he has been living. Mr. Yeltsin will take that home and provide Mr. Gorbachev somewhere else to live. Gorbachev will also get the use of a limousine, some bodyguards, and the perks that a number of retired officials get, including special commissary privileges, etc.
Well, now, Jim, Gorbachev said today, I have big plans. Do you have any idea what they are?
He is keeping them very close to his chest. He does want to remain involved in politics. That has become apparent. He, of course, has been invited by many people around the world to speak, and there's a lot of money in that. Perhaps he could go in that direction, but he simply has not committed himself, at least not yet.
Has anything changed in Moscow, on the streets of Moscow, in one day? One day Gorbachev is still at least technically in power. The next day he's out. Do you notice any difference?
Well, for all the attention that we have given his passing, most people, particularly here in Moscow, and I must say in other parts of what used to be the Soviet Union, have taken all this rather calmly, in fact, indifferently. They, of course, have known for some time that Gorbachev was irrelevant to the political process, that he was on his way out, and there has not been very much reaction at all. People are simply too focused on their daily living, trying to get enough food in their stomachs to be concerned at all about politics.
I suppose that's the thing about Gorbachev. He brought a large measure of political reform for which the world applauds him, but he didn't bring any food.
And this political reform, unfortunately, right now, and Mr. Gorbachev has admitted this, the people here take that for granted.
Well, Boris Yeltsin, the man who has replaced Gorbachev as the dominant political and power figure in that part of the world, says, of course, that he is a great Democrat, and so far he has acted like one. But there is a fear that, given time, Yeltsin will attempt to become every much a czar as some of his predecessors. What do you think?
Very mixed feelings about that here, Sam. Now, some people say we need to have a strong hand. The problem with Gorbachev, many say, is that he was too vacillating. He couldn't make up his mind which way to go. At least Yeltsin knows the direction that he wants to take Russia. Outside of Russia, there is that feeling. Are we creating here a new czar? Will he try to lord over the weaker members of this new Commonwealth? And everybody will be on guard against that.
Jim, sum it up for us. You've covered Gorbachev for many years. Where do you think history will put him?
Well, it's obvious, Sam, that Gorbachev will go down as the man who radically changed not only the Soviet Union, but through his reforms, all of Eastern Europe, and certainly changed the relationship between this country and America. But Mr. Gorbachev will also go down as a man who simply couldn't keep up with those rapid changes that he started. He was simply not able, as Mr. Yeltsin was, to see how quickly things were moving and to move along. He still clung to some outdated ideas. He still wanted to keep the Communist Party and try to reform it. He still was not willing to go wholeheartedly behind the market economy and really move into radical reform. So he was obviously a flawed leader, but one of the greatest leaders of this century.
So Gorbachev dared, but not greatly enough.
Not far enough.
Thank you, Jim Laurie. Don't forget to watch 2020 tomorrow night. And later on Nightline, we'll report on some people in the United States struggling to help loved ones trapped in the fighting in Yugoslavia. I'm Sam Donaldson in Washington. Diane will be back next Thursday. Please join us then for another edition of Primetime Live. Until then, everyone here at ABC News wishes you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We leave you now with some impressions of a remarkable man, the words and images of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Should I denounce whole generations as if they had lived in vain? No. We will never trample underfoot the work of our fathers and our grandfathers. I promise you, comrades, to do my utmost to faithfully serve our party, our people, and the great Leninist cause. Our people can't go on living like this. I have to make changes. This is my destiny. God has given us enough wisdom to find ways to bring an improvement in our relations.
I'd like to say hello to you. I want to say hello to you.
The road ahead will be tough, but we will go ahead, and we will build on what has been achieved and make something new. The use or threat of force can no longer be an instrument of foreign policy. We have reached agreement in principle to give official status to our many religions. The next year will be decisive. It will settle our fate for a decade, or even a century. Which republics will be with us, and on what terms? Everything is at stake. Everything. Comrades, this is barbaric. Dictatorship is no answer. We are on the right path. We must stick to our guns and not falter. I am resigning. Let it be my protest, if you will, against dictatorship. I have to speak out now that I've seen the blood of our people flow. We, the Soviet people, must not break apart. I had always said that a coup d'etat was impossible, that only a madman would attempt it. I was isolated from the country and the world. The objective was to crush me morally, to crush my family, but they failed. They say I've returned to a changed country. I could even say a different country altogether.
Our next question comes from Los Angeles.
Should any country in the world continue to live under communism?
The experience of our history allows us to say decisively that the model developed in our country has failed. I will resign. If the process ends this way, I will resign. But please understand, I want this to succeed. I do not want it to fail. I did all that I could. You know, I think in my place, others would have quit this business long ago.
Transcripts, send $5 to Journal Graphics, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado.
Primetime is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.